Hello and welcome to this RSK Biosensors First Thursday Club webinar. I'm Des Delahaye. I'm a director of RSK Biosensors and Nature Positive, and it's my pleasure to host today's presentation. So our speaker today is Tom Mason. He leads on our corporate biodiversity engagements at Nature Positive. He's led strategic environmental, social and governance projects in a range of sectors, including textiles, automotives and steel production. And in the finance and ESG data sectors, he has worked with institutional investors to develop biodiversity impacts and risk modelling. More recently, he's been guiding institutions and corporations in assessing how their global value chains impact on nature and addressing nature-related risks of business activities through, for example, the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, or TNFD. And it is TNFD that is the subject of today's webinar. But just before we get started, I've got a couple of housekeeping issues to just run through with you. First of all, your mics will be kept off throughout the presentation for obvious reasons, but that's not because we don't want to hear from you. So if you've got any questions, then please pop them in the chat. We will try to get round as many of those questions as possible in the Q&A session after the presentation, and those that we don't get to, we'll see if Tom can find the time to provide a response by email. Shortly after the presentation, you'll be sent a questionnaire or a link to a questionnaire. It'd be great if you can find a couple of minutes to answer as many questions as possible, as this helps us make sure that we are keeping this content relevant and engaging for our audience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom. Off you go, Tom.
Lovely, thanks Des, and I'm just going to turn off my my camera for this so you can all focus on the presentation. So hi everyone, I'm Tom Mason, Associate Director at Nature Positive, and I'm leading, as Des said, our client engagements on nature and biodiversity assessments for supply chain companies and financial institutions. So today our main topic is TNFD, so the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I'm going to give a general background and introduction to the topic and the current regulatory and policy landscape, an overview of what TNFD and the LEAP approach is, and then from a practitioner's perspective, moving step by step through that LEAP process, drawing on some real case studies to highlight some of the issues and difficulties that companies might be facing going through this assessment. Before getting into the details of TNFD, it's worth understanding the general background here and what's driving the momentum behind the world of nature-related disclosures. And that's that we're in a dual climate and nature crisis, driven by economic activity, to put it bluntly. Destructive practices by businesses and consumption are degrading ecosystems. They're driving biodiversity loss on a global scale and are contributing significantly to climate change. And it's not just a problem for the natural world, but for businesses, the economy and wider society, because industries as a whole and businesses depend on natural resources, and they depend on functioning ecosystem services. And this interconnectedness between nature and business is what poses real physical, potentially systemic risks, and those risks are becoming increasingly severe and increasingly frequent. So the common starting point when we beginning to think about the business interface with nature is looking at impacts and dependencies on nature. And when we talk about impacts, you can think broadly with these 5 overarching impact categories, or these pressures on nature: pollution, land, water and sea use change, resource consumption and exploitation, climate change and invasive species. Now, in a technical assessment of this, there are more than 5 impact pathways in which businesses can impact nature, but these 5 overarching categories are widely recognized and they're easily understood. And when we talk about dependencies on nature, we're looking at the reliance on ecosystems and the services that they provide to society and to businesses. And you can broadly group these as provisioning services. So think about how nature supplies us with food, water, timber, or natural fibers, for example. And you can categorize them into regulating and maintaining services. I mean, these are less tangible, but it includes essential functions like filtering pollutants from water or filtering from soil, sequestering carbon, or regulating the climate. And a nice example of how these impacts and dependencies can affect business is actually looking at the California almond industry. That contributes 80% of the global almond supply. It's worth about $15 billion a year, but biodiversity loss driven by drought and increasing temperatures has reduced to a reduction in the pollinator population. Now, this pollinator decline necessitates either artificial pollination, which is extremely costly and time intensive, or you need to outsource pollination services. That means you bring in bees, potentially invasive species, from other regions. What that means for the bottom line of a business is, because you no longer rely on natural pollination and you have to outsource it and pay for it, you're increasing your production costs by 13%. That's an estimation, but for a $15 billion industry, it's quite significant. And there are many, many other different examples of how this can be impacting businesses. I'm not going to give all those examples today, but that's just a nice one to highlight what that looks like in business terms. So now that it's common understanding that the dual climate and nature crisis poses serious stability risks and financial risks to entire sectors, we're seeing a significant shift in attitudes. Businesses have to incorporate nature and climate into their business strategy. And until recently, there's been relatively little action on this because either companies didn't fundamentally really understand what this meant in terms of their interactions with nature and their reliance on nature. If they understood it, perhaps they didn't really know how to measure it or to monitor it. And thirdly, but probably quite importantly, they mostly weren't actually required to assess this or to report on it. And now since 2021, when the Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, was initiated, we've seen a steadily increasing stream of rules and regulations that are compelling companies to address this topic specifically. So you might be familiar with some or all of these policy initiatives and frameworks. Most of them have only recently been finalized. So we're seeing unprecedented advances here in terms of international policy, in terms of development of frameworks and market-led initiatives. Most notably, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This was an outcome of COP15 in December 2022, and it sets 4 goals and 23 targets aimed at reducing threats to biodiversity, ensuring sustainable resource use, and mainstreaming the tools and data to enable this. And specifically, Target 15 within that Global Biodiversity Framework asks businesses to report on their impacts and dependencies on nature. The European Union has also been very ambitious. We've seen regulations aimed at preventing deforestation within global supply chains, targeting key commodities, and aimed at restoring degraded natural ecosystems. And sorry, I've just scrolled through a few slides there, so I'm going to go back. There we go. So importantly for businesses, we have a new set of regulatory disclosures and frameworks which are front and foremost. We have CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is affecting companies with European operations and revenue streams, requiring them to disclose on a range of environmental and social impacts and risks. We have TCFD, Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the Carbon Disclosure Project. These deal with greenhouse gas reporting, and these are already quite well established, so some of you may be familiar with that. And then we have TNFD, today's topic, that focuses on nature, ecosystems, and affected communities. And last but not least, science-based targets for nature. And this sets detailed technical guidance for setting targets and monitoring those targets over time to reduce impacts on nature. On to TNFD then. So Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. What is it? So for those of you familiar with climate and greenhouse gas assessments, like I just mentioned, this builds on TCFD for climate. So it is aligned to that in principle. TNFD outlines 14 disclosure points that companies are recommended to make, which addresses corporate governance, business strategy, risk management, and target setting. And importantly, it's encouraging companies to take a full value chain view. So not only looking at the impact of and risks to direct operations, but also considering upstream supply chain and, if relevant, downstream product life cycles. The TNFD disclosures are voluntary. However, what we're seeing is that investors are increasingly expecting companies to disclose on the topic of nature and biodiversity. In addition to this, the CSRD regulations in Europe that I just mentioned on the previous slide are very much mandatory, and these explicitly point to the TNFD methodology when it comes to the assessments for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what's TNFD actually aiming to achieve? Well, firstly, TNFD is the first set of guidance, structured guidance, that provides companies with a risk management and disclosure framework specific to nature, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. It benefits investors because it lets them value nature-related risks and manage portfolios accordingly. And it benefits companies because it enables them to embed nature into business decision-making and ensure long-term business model resilience in the face of that dual climate and nature crisis that I talked about. So to help companies to put this into practice, TNFD's developed something called the LEAP methodology. And the LEAP methodology guides businesses to conduct assessments of their nature-related impacts, dependencies, opportunities, and risks. And it's quite well structured. There's an initial locate phase, and this emphasizes the importance of location-specific assessments because, unlike greenhouse gas emissions, which can be dispersed far and wide from the point of pollution, impacts and dependencies on nature are far more acute, and they typically occur in very specific locations that need to be addressed on a site-by-site basis. The evaluate and assess phases involve identifying the material impacts and dependencies to the business within the supply chain and within the direct operations, putting this into business context and defining nature-related risks and opportunities. And the prepare phase of that LEAP framework involves embedding these findings into strategy, developing action plans, identifying resources and financing to address those risks and opportunities. And also, it's the point at which you're supposed to define your measurement metrics in terms of how you're going to measure those impacts or risks and opportunities over time. So those TNFD core recommendations were finalized last year, and there's also specific sector guidance, which is in draft version and already available. I'm not going to detail all of that in this call, but you can go to the TNFD website and get the details. There's a nice 200-page document about the LEAP process, but hopefully my coming slides are going to summarize what that process looks like in practical terms for a business. So since those recommendations were released, we've been partnering with a lot of companies to work through their TNFD assessments and to develop biodiversity strategies, getting ready for public disclosures on nature. And the very first thing that you need to do before you actually get stuck into what can be potentially a complex technical assessment is really the basics, defining your scope and understanding what it is that you want to achieve from this assessment of your nature-related impacts and dependencies and opportunities and risks, but also scoping what you can realistically achieve. Very important to note that the TNFD LEAP process is meant to be an iterative process. So it's meant to be something that companies revisit every year over time, and that each time you revisit the assessment, you improve the granularity and you improve the data that you use. The scope of your assessment is going to depend entirely on your business structure, and it's going to depend on where you have control or influence in your value chain. And there's a lot of complexity here because you might have hundreds of operational sites, you might have thousands of suppliers, you potentially have tens of thousands of combinations of products and input materials. You're also going to have varying data availability and quality. You're going to have mixed supply chain visibility, which is going to present a whole bunch of difficulties in that assessment. And you also have to deal with winning stakeholder buy-in as well, because not everybody is going to be convinced that nature and biodiversity is a material topic straight off the bat. But once you've established that scope, you need to conduct a gap analysis before you really start with the assessment. If you don't begin this process with a gap analysis, you're going to run into issues where you can't answer questions that you thought you could or you really wanted to. You risk falling short of the ambitions that you might be setting for yourself. And importantly, you're going to likely waste a lot of time trying to assess things with incomplete data. And the result of that is that you risk drawing incorrect conclusions. On the positive side, one thing a lot of companies don't necessarily realize is that you're not going to be starting this from scratch, and that you more than likely have data to draw upon that can get you started. So you can draw upon, for example, TCFD work, including water risk or climate risk, physical risk assessments, and you can draw on existing environmental management plans and practices across your operational sites. So you may already be collecting a good amount of information about pollution, which is relevant to a nature and biodiversity assessment. You'll need to identify capacity gaps, so gaps in your skills and knowledge in the business, and identify who are the people who are best placed to lead the topic internally, as well as bridge that gap, perhaps between your senior teams and your specialist consultants. And you are going to need to identify data gaps. This is really important. Assess internal data for its accessibility. There might be things you think you have, which you don't, or which are very difficult to get, especially if your business is very dispersed. You have to assess the quality, the reliability of the data, how long is it being collected for, and how consistent is it? And you need to assess external data as well. There's loads of external data out there about nature and biodiversity, but you need to think about, is it suitable for your business in the assessment that you're going to do? How accurate and precise is it? How useful is it? How relevant is it to your business? So this is an important thing to consider in the gap analysis. Be quite careful with that selection of external data. So you've defined the scope, you've defined the feasibility, you've measured your gaps. The first stage of the assessment is locating the business nature interfaces. Now, this can be what can seem like a daunting task up front, especially if you've got very complex, deep and wide supply chains and extensive operations. It's important here to take note of the TNFD's guidance on locations. You must identify ecologically sensitive sites before you start this assessment. You don't have to assess every single site under your operations, only really those that are ecologically sensitive. And an ecologically sensitive site is one that ticks any of those 5 boxes that you see on the screen. If you're going to screenshot any slide, screenshot this one, because that's an important set of criteria. So when you're conducting this locate phase assessment, there are high-level screening tools and public tools which you can use. So a couple of good ones are the WWF risk filters and IBAT. There's a free version of IBAT on the TNFD website. Quite often our companies that we work with come to us having already done that initial screening, so they have an idea where they think priority sites might be. These are really helpful tools for initial screening because they highlight potentially sensitive sites, but you do need a certain level of environmental and ecological expertise here to interpret the outputs of the tools and to make sure that you're keeping it contextual to the business. So typically what we'll do at this point is look closely at those potentially sensitive areas, drawing on additional geospatial analysis. So we'll look at regional or local data sets where it's appropriate, or draw in other complementary data to get a bit more granularity and define those sites properly before we move into the assessment. So I did promise at the start some case studies, and I'm going to go through every part of this LEAP assessment with a case study overview. Here's a particularly complex locate phase assessment. So this is for a forestry sector company, and it's complex because they own 180,000 hectares, and all of it is in scope of the assessment because it's all ecologically sensitive. If it's not used for provisioning timber, then it's already a conservation easement, or it's already near a protected area, or it's rich in biodiversity or threatened species. So in a case like this, public screening tools don't really, or publicly available screening tools don't really help us. And what we need to do is to find regional, local data about habitat classifications, species distributions. We'll draw on internal land management data, for example, forest maturity, forest density, species surveys, and land use characteristics. And we need to map how the forest stands in the operation interact with other important ecological features, either within the sites or external to them. So thinking about water bodies, streams, or nearby habitats and certain land classes. Once we've done a very thorough assessment of the areas, what we can do then with such a complex set of sites is we can make a sensible classification. So we can identify areas and group them into buckets of highest risk or highest opportunity, or already contributing positive impacts. And sometimes it's a combination of different factors. But once we group so many sites into buckets, then we can make sense of complex location data. We can be sure that it's underpinned by robust data sets, and then we can frame the rest of our assessment when we go into the impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities phase, considering those buckets of sites, whether they're high risk or high opportunity. So not all locate phase assessments are that complex. Actually, most of them are not necessarily, unless you're in the forestry and agriculture sector, but it's important to understand what it can entail. Once you've identified those priority sites in your operations, following that TNFD LEAP assessment approach, we look at the impacts and dependencies. So once again, there are useful publicly available tools here. Encore is one, and the Science Based Targets Network have a sector materiality tool. Now, these are good starting points because what those tools do is they map certain business activities, general types of activities, to impact pressures and ecosystem dependencies. So thinking back to those 5 pressures that I mentioned at the start and the types of ecosystem services, and they give a materiality rating. So they grade it from very low to very high, depending on how important that ecosystem service is to the business activity, or how big the impact is of that business activity on the environment. Now, these are a guide. They're not specific, they're not an exact science, and companies do need to be careful, right? If you're going to do this yourself, not to take the outputs of these tools as the final result. So it's important to assess whether the impacts and dependencies that you get from these screening tools are relevant in the context of the business, thinking about your operations and supply chains. And importantly on that point, evaluating direct operations of the business and evaluating the supply chain usually requires a different methodology, because with operations, typically we know the exact location, we know the type of activity that's conducted there, and because we know exactly where it is, we can pinpoint the physical ecology, important ecological features, species, land classes, rivers and streams, forest, everything that might be sensitive. When it comes to the supply chain, there are many more challenges, primarily with data availability and supply chain transparency. Now, hopefully you'll discover these during the gap analysis, but what we do with many of companies we're working with who are doing this everybody's doing this for the first time, is we begin with a high-level screening using those tools. We'll identify high-impact commodities. We'll identify areas of the supply chain with notable actual or potential impacts and dependencies, or where we have poor visibility. And we will try to do a much more location-specific assessment where we can. But what we found is the biggest part of the supply chain assessment is engaging directly with suppliers to get better granularity on things like sustainable sourcing policies and practices, supplier transparency beyond tier 1. So can you engage with your suppliers and say, okay, who are our tier 2, 3 and beyond suppliers? Do we know the source of origin? Can we trace a chain of custody for certain items that we're sourcing or are used in the production of our products. And then we identify as well the financially significant aspects of the sourcing. So what are the highest value procurement items and the most important inputs to the products or service that you're producing? So this is a bit more of a qualitative approach when you're looking at the supply chain, and you do need to engage with suppliers. It's quite unavoidable. You can do a high-level screening, but at some point you need to speak to them and ask them what's going on in their supply chains. And importantly, there's the materiality aspect of this, and whether something is material is not only defined by the screening tools like Encore, but you as a business have to define that yourself. You have to assess the actual context and the practices and the exposure to the potential impacts and the risks, as well as the activities of your suppliers. So this case study is a reality for a lot of companies. In a case like this, the procurement or the supply chain data is messy, or it's difficult to aggregate because you've not had to do this kind of assessment before, or data is distributed across many different business units. Visibility of suppliers beyond tier 1 is low, or it's inconsistent. So how do you approach a supply chain assessment when you have those kind of difficulties and it's your first time to do this? The first thing that we usually start off with is a basic life cycle assessment of the products, and we working together with the businesses to understand what are the inputs, so we know not only what the actual product and the potential impact is, but what about all the materials that feed into its production and those supply chains. Then we'll assess the impacts and dependencies across that whole supply chain, considering all the inputs. We'll factor in practices like circular economy initiatives, recycled material use versus virgin material use. And we'll create a heat map, something like you see on the right-hand side, specific to the business, which highlights the likely areas of impacts and dependencies. And as I said before, this is not the final result. This is the first iteration for many companies. You will work through this process over the coming years to improve the accuracy and the detail behind that. But based on that first assessment, what you can do is you can identify areas of the supply chain that you want to deep dive into, where you want to fill the gaps and where you want to engage with suppliers a bit more closely. Now, once you know your priority locations and you know your material impacts and dependencies, the assess phase of the LEAP process is really about bridging that gap between technical assessment and integration into business strategy. So when we think about risks, typically we look at physical, transitional, or systemic risks, and opportunities can be anything from direct conservation activities to financing and funding conservation or research, to then more business-specific opportunities like resource efficiency, procurement criteria, or product design and delivery. And there's quite often a logical link between the risks and opportunities that you're going to identify in this process. And I can give an example here. So we conducted an assessment for an electronics manufacturer, and what we found is that there were significant long-term supply chain risks related to water availability that could disrupt the supply of virgin aluminium. Now, for some products that they were producing, they can't replace that virgin aluminium. It's unavoidable. But for other aspects of product design, it's feasible to use alternative materials, or it's feasible to work more closely with the big suppliers to increase recycled aluminium content. And both of these options significantly reduce the risk of supply chain shocks. And you'll find there are many, many examples of that when you look deeply into your supply chains, and especially when you think about the longer term nature-related implications. So, departing a bit from manufacturing, here's a really interesting case for nature-related risks and opportunities. And this was for a financial services firm. So we looked at impacts and dependencies across an investment portfolio, and we accounted for very diverse types of business and investments, over 200 different territories and 300 different industries. And we mapped out the risks and opportunities in terms of the severity and scale of the impacts and the severity and scale of the dependencies of those businesses. And along with that, we looked at the specific potential impact pathways and the exact types of dependencies that face the businesses in those sectors. And what this assessment enabled this financial services firm to do was to A, quantify nature-related risk exposure, fundamental to them, B, set a plan for sector and client engagement on the topic of nature-related risk, and C, it enabled them to identify specific opportunities beyond direct client engagement where they could make positive contributions. So thinking about the biggest sector risks and how could they invest in research or direct conservation activities, or partner with clients to mitigate these risks or to help find solutions to these risks in the long term. So they were quite ambitious on that, I have to say. Now, following that locate, assess, evaluate phase, you arrive at the final step of the LEAP process, which is the prepare phase. And this is all about getting ready to disclose your appropriate approaches and findings that are relevant to either the voluntary TNFD disclosures or the mandatory CSRD disclosures. And it's important to think about what kinds of targets your business wants to set at this point. And target setting, it can be linked to things like business model sustainability, for example, reducing or eliminating the use of certain virgin materials like plastic or mined ores, or scaling up the use of circular initiatives, either within your own operations or in partnership with major suppliers. Or those targets can be much more technical. So you can look at the science-based targets for nature, aiming to reduce things like land footprint or land use intensity, water withdrawal or pollution. It's worth noting that you can do the TNFD LEAP assessment and the science-based targets in tandem. We do that. We work with companies who want to do both of them at the same time, and they are slightly different because the science-based targets are more technically rigorous, but the frameworks are aligned by design. Now, from my perspective within Nature Positive, having worked with a lot of companies on these assessments, what we're seeing now is that businesses are really starting to realize the benefits of conducting these assessments of nature and biodiversity within the scope of their entire value chain. And the benefits that they're noticing is that it's highlighting risks which were not previously considered to be material, but they are. It's encouraging horizon scanning and risk management on longer time scales. And it's also making them think about longer term sustainability initiatives, supplier engagement and selection, investment decisions, anything which can also give them a competitive advantage in the market, moving first or acting where competitors are not. And building on this, more advanced companies are already looking to conduct quite comprehensive scenario planning. And this is building together or bringing together their climate and their nature assessments and scenarios, technical environmental data, and really trying to understand the potential issues and what the outcomes might be on varying timescales. So I'm going to end it there. I think I'm right on time. So thank you all for hanging on. I hope that was quite informative. And I'm going to pass now to Des because I think that we have some questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom, for an excellent overview of the TNFD initiative and the LEAP methodology. So yes, we do have a few questions here. I'm going to start off with a question about the uptake of TNFD in different sectors. Have there been some obvious early adopters of TNFD that you've noticed?
Yeah, well, TNFD have just announced themselves a list of companies that have committed to being early adopters. I think there's about 350 companies that have committed to that. A large amount of those are finance sector companies, and because of course for the finance sector this is fundamentally a big risk, and it's an area where they don't have great visibility. So they are pushing for that and pushing their portfolio companies to address this. Other sectors, I think agriculture and food and beverage and highly polluting sectors like chemical as well as electronic manufacturers are some of the main sectors that you see in that early adopters list.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that financial companies are early adopters, because of course that will push the companies that they lend money to provide financial services for, into perhaps also going down the same route eventually, we hope.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we discussed that earlier. You know, a lot of the companies who are sort of approaching us now with the idea to conduct these TNFD or related assessments are being pushed, if not by regulatory drivers, by their investors, saying that you need to do this. You know, we need to understand your nature-related risks in better detail.
Sure. Okay. Another question is, could businesses that are superficially engaging with the TNFD initiative, could they commit to actually doing very little? They could suggest that they've got no influence over their supply chains, and so claim that they haven't got a lot of movement in order to improve things. But they could claim that they are engaging with the process and so try to get some sort of green points for doing so. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, they could do that, but I think it would be quite short-sighted for companies to do that. The reason being that in assessing whether nature and biodiversity is a material issue for the business, this is supposed to be a stakeholder-led process. So it's not meant to be something that the business decides on its own. You're meant to get input from your stakeholders, from your investors, from the board, from the senior leadership, from different points of view to determine that. So if companies go ahead, you know, on their own and say, well, we've done the basic assessment and we don't find that it's material. If your peers in the same sector have not done that and they've taken it rather more seriously and done a full-blown assessment and identified a whole level of risks, you will be questioned about why you don't have the same level of risk as your peers in the same industry. So I think that's certainly a short-term thinking if companies do that.
Oh, okay, thanks. Another question here. How would an organisation's natural capital account and the TNFD framework be used together? Should one, for example, be implemented before the other?
The natural capital accounts into TNFD. Well, one of the things that you do need to assess as part of TNFD is it's not all about negative impacts. It's also about positive impacts and resource consumption. So I don't know if this question is coming from a forestry manager, but yes, you need this information. You need to know the volume of resources in your operation that you're using. If you're talking about conservation and restoration activities, natural capital from that perspective, yes, you also need to quantify it and you need to know it, because if you're making positive contributions, you need to disclose that because that's a positive point. I'm not sure if I answered that one correctly. Maybe that needs a bit more detail.
I think what you're saying is that understanding your natural capital account is part of the process of going through.
Yes, it is. Yep.
The TNFD process. So I think you did answer that. Thanks. Another question here about supply chains. So as you've hinted in your talk, supply chains are often complex and they rely on getting information from third parties, the suppliers. Have you noticed in your experience any reluctance on the part of suppliers to engage and provide the information necessary?
Yes, to an extent, and it's a mixed bag. I mean, obviously, suppliers are a bit reluctant to all of a sudden hand over lots of lots of data or then go and conduct their own assessments. But I think the bottom line is that we're seeing generally most suppliers are compliant because they recognize that if their major buyers have a serious sustainability push and it's part of their procurement criteria that they have to meet, then they don't really have a choice and they have to do this, because what some companies are now starting to say is, well, if you can't meet these sustainability criteria, or you're not at least going to commit to further investigating these risks that we've identified, we're not going to be that interested in buying from you. It's going to be as simple as that. That I think there is going to be an issue of that, well, if you don't comply, then we won't source from you. In general, we're seeing that most suppliers are compliant with the requests.
Great. And also related to supply chains, I mean, in some cases, I imagine that the company that receives the materials from suppliers doesn't actually know where they come from. Originally, they're getting them perhaps from a wholesaler who's mixing supplies of material from various different sources and so on. Is that a particular challenge in trying to understand exposure to impacts from your supply chain?
Yes, that is a big problem. I mean, many companies, especially OEMs, or companies who are reliant on OEMs, those supply chains are going to be not transparent at all. You know, beyond your major suppliers, you will have very likely in going through a first assessment, no idea the source of origin for a lot of materials. But it's not to say that that information can't be obtained. It can be obtained. At some point, everybody knows where everything comes from. But it's how do you go about the engagement then with suppliers, or how do you identify your priority suppliers? Because you can't do them all at once, but you have to define the key issues in the supply chain, the major suppliers, and work closely with them to get the information that you need in the highest risk areas. It can be obtained, but it will take time, and I think that's a reality that companies have to account for. It will take several years in some cases to get clear supply chain data.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Another question then, is there a danger that companies might try to use internal staff with little relevant expertise to deliver on TNFD? Are the tools required for doing the LEAP assessment, for example, are they sufficiently well prescribed for a non-expert to be able to do a good job of that?
Yes, there is the possibility that companies will do that. We see that, and I mentioned it in my presentation, a lot of companies will come to us having already done an initial high-level screening. So they'll use the sector materiality screening tools, or they'll use the risk filters to identify possible sites. But usually they'll come to us and then ask for the deep dive. These tools are useful, and for many companies doing the first assessment, they will be good enough to a certain extent. But if you don't have the expertise to interpret the outputs of some of these tools, yeah, there is a very real risk that you will go wrong. And that's why it's important, before you begin the assessments, that you do a proper gap analysis that actually looks at the gaps in your skills. Because if you don't have people who don't understand the topic quite thoroughly, you shouldn't, I mean, I don't think you should be really getting them to then proceed with a technical assessment themselves, even if there are public tools available.
Sure. Okay, thanks. And I think this will probably be our final question. Have you got any great examples of companies cascading nature-related knowledge rather than the knowledge being retained in a specific department?
Yes, I mean, I probably can't name names because those things are ongoing, but sure. I showed a case study there of a financial services sector, and this is actually a really good example of a business where the nature and biodiversity topic had not been looked at in detail, and there was very little knowledge within the business. We did this assessment. We identified the priority units within the business where they need to take this topic more seriously. And what they've done then as part of the action plan, and we've also worked with manufacturing companies who have done the same, is that part of their action plan following this assessment is to say, okay, who knows the most about biodiversity in the company, who needs to know the most, and how do we begin training or workshops to actually build up that knowledge and that skill set, and how do we begin to train people on using the relevant tools. So companies are doing it, but it's very, very early days, to be honest. Most companies, well, all companies are doing these assessments for the first time. So for many, it is the first time that they're setting up an internal biodiversity action plan, which involves training and capacity, but it is happening.
Well, that's great to know that they're starting to engage with the broader company on these issues. Okay, well, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Tom. I'm gonna end it there so that we're going to end in good time. But just before we go, it just remains for me to say thanks very much, Tom, for an excellent talk. And thank you all for attending and engaging with questions and so on. Our next First Thursday Club webinar will be on April the 4th, when Elizabeth Clements is going to talk about the enigmatic and endangered freshwater pearl mussel. So I hope many of you will tune into that. So until then, goodbye and thanks very much.